The jade dragon was the only beautiful thing left. It sat on the back of the bar, no bigger than a man's fist, its polished surface a deep, cool green that seemed to drink the dusty sunlight slanting through the saloon's windows. Mylin ran a soft cloth over its curved back, her daily ritual. It was the last gift her father had given her before the fire took him and her mother, leaving her with the saloon, its debts, and a name that marked her as an outsider in the town of Stone Creek, Nevada. At 22, she had learned that survival was a matter of quiet persistence, of keeping the glasses clean and the books balanced, and never, ever showing fear. The swing doors of the Jade Dragon Saloon creaked open, casting a long shadow that cut across the floorboards. Mayor Alastair Finch stepped inside, and the quiet hum of the room died. He was not a large man, but he filled a space with an unnerving stillness, his dark suit always perfectly brushed, his smile thin and precise. Two burly men, hired muscle from the mines, flanked him like stone bookends. "Miss Lynn," Finch said, his voice smooth as poured whiskey. He removed his hat, a gesture that was meant to look respectful but felt like a king entering a peasant's hut. "A pleasant afternoon." Mai placed the cloth down, her hand steady, though a cold knot was tightening in her stomach. "Mayor, what can I do for you?" The few patrons in the saloon, a pair of old prospectors and a freight wagon driver, suddenly found the contents of their glasses fascinating. Their eyes were fixed on the tabletops, their shoulders hunched. This was how Finch operated, in the open, using the town's silence as his weapon. Finch glided to the bar, his men taking up positions by the door. He slid a folded document across the polished wood. A small matter of business. A debt to be settled. Mai did not touch the paper. She had been dreading this day for months. Finch had been buying up the properties on Main Street one by one, using whispers, threats, and the kind of legal paper that always seemed to favor him. "My father paid his debts. I have the ledgers." "Ah, but this was a personal loan," Finch said, tapping a manicured finger on the document. "For the saloon's expansion, I believe. A considerable sum." With interest, of course, he smiled that thin smile again. "The total of which, I am sorry to say, is now equivalent to the value of this establishment. I am simply here to collect what is owed." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She knew it was a lie. Her father had been a cautious man, proud of his independence. He would never have indebted himself to the likes of Alastair Finch. "This is a forgery." The mayor's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went flat and hard, like chips of obsidian. "That is a serious accusation. One you would have a difficult time proving. The territorial judge is a dear friend of mine. He vacations at my ranch." He unfolded the paper, revealing a string of dense legal text and a signature at the bottom that was a crude, clumsy imitation of her father's elegant script. "The deed is as good as mine, Miss Lynn. I am prepared to be generous. You may take your personal effects and be on the evening stage. I will even pay your fare." This was the final move in his game. He wasn't just taking her saloon, he was erasing her parents' legacy. The jade dragon on the bar seemed to watch her, its stone eyes holding the weight of her father's pride. Something inside her, a quiet, stubborn thing she had inherited from her mother, refused to break. "No," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the saloon. "This is my property. It is not for sale, and it is not yours to take." Finch's pleasant facade finally cracked. A flicker of genuine anger crossed his face. He had expected her to crumble. He had expected tears, pleading. He had not expected defiance. "You are in no position to refuse." "I said no." He sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. "Very well." He gave a short, sharp nod to one of his men. But before the man could move, Finch did something himself. He reached across the bar, not to grab the paper, but to shove her. It wasn't a violent blow, but it was contemptuous, dismissive. The push sent her stumbling backward, her balance lost. She fell hard, her shoulder striking the floorboards with a painful crack. A gasp went through the room, quickly stifled. From the floor, the world was tilted, the faces of the patrons a blur of shame and fear. The jade dragon sat on the bar above her, a silent, green witness to her humiliation. Finch looked down at her, his expression one of utter disdain. The property is now under my administration. See that you are gone within the hour. At that moment, the saloon doors swung open again. The newcomer paused on the threshold, a silhouette against the blinding summer sun. He was a stranger, dressed in dusty trail clothes, a worn gun belt riding low on his hips. He was not big or imposing, but he moved with a deliberate economy that made the air around him seem to settle. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, took in the scene in an instant. Mai on the floor, Finch standing over her like a vulture, the two thugs by the door, the averted gazes of the patrons. The stranger stepped inside, letting the doors swing shut behind him. His gaze settled on Finch. His voice was low and carried a gravelly edge, the sound of dust and distance. "Seems to me," he said, his tone conversational, "the ladies owed an apology." Finch turned, his irritation clear. He sized up the stranger and saw nothing of consequence, just another drifter passing through. "This is a private business matter, friend. I suggest you move along." The stranger's eye shifted to Mai, still on the floor. He offered a hand. It was a calloused, steady hand. Hesitantly, she took it. He pulled her to her feet with surprising strength, his touch brief and respectful. He did not look at her again, his attention returning to the mayor. "Private or not," the stranger said, his voice unchanging, "where I come from, men don't put their hands on women. And they don't conduct business with them on the floor." A dangerous energy now filled the room. Finch's men straightened up, their hands moving instinctively closer to their coats. The mayor's face flushed with anger at being challenged in public. "You have a name, stranger?" Finch demanded, his voice tight. "Jonah," the man replied simply. He took a step toward the bar, placing himself between Mai and the mayor. "And I'm thirsty. But I find I've lost my appetite for establishments where the owner is treated so poorly." It was a direct challenge, a line drawn in the dust. Finch recognized it for what it was. His thin smile returned, but this time it was all teeth. "You're making a grave mistake. This town, and everything in it, belongs to me." "Property deeds are funny things," Jonah said, his eyes flicking to the forged document still on the bar. "They have to be filed with the territorial office. They require a legitimate seal. And the signature has to stand up to scrutiny. That one looks like it was signed with a shaky hand in a dark room." Mai stared at him. How could a simple drifter know such things? Finch's composure began to fray. This stranger was not just a gunman, he was something else, something unexpected and far more dangerous. "You know a lot about the law for a man who looks like he sleeps in a ditch," Finch sneered. "I've had occasion to read," Jonah said. "I've also had occasion to see bullies try to steal what isn't theirs." He looked at Finch's men. "You two get paid enough to get hurt for this man?" The question hung in the air. The two thugs exchanged a nervous glance. They were paid to intimidate, not to face a man who stood as still and calm as a coiled snake. Finch had lost control of the room. His public display of power had been turned against him. He snatched the fraudulent deed from the bar. "You will regret this," he hissed at Jonah. To his men, he barked, "Let's go." They followed him out, but Finch paused at the door. He turned, his gaze locking onto Mai. The mask of civility was gone, replaced by pure, cold malice. "This isn't over. That deed will be filed by sundown. This saloon will be mine, and you," he added, his eyes flicking to Jonah, "will be a corpse in the desert." The doors swung shut, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. The prospectors and the wagon driver, sensing the immediate danger had passed, quickly finished their drinks, tossed coins on the bar, and scurried out without a word. Mai was left alone with the quiet stranger who had just saved her, for the moment. Her body ached from the fall, but it was the tremor deep inside her that was worse. She had faced down the most powerful man in town, and now she had an enemy who would not stop. Jonah turned to her, his expression unreadable. The pale eyes that had been so hard when facing Finch were now softer, though still watchful. "He mentioned a deed," Jonah said, his voice low. "May I see your copy?" Mai hesitated for only a second. She trusted him, though she didn't know why. Perhaps it was because he had looked at Finch with the same contempt she felt, or because he had helped her up when no one else would. She nodded, leading him toward the small office behind the bar where her father's strongbox was kept. The lock was old and stiff, but it opened with a familiar click. Inside, beneath neat stacks of currency and coin, was a heavy vellum document, folded and tied with a faded red ribbon. The saloon's true deed. She handed it to him. His fingers, rough and calloused, were surprisingly gentle as he took it. He untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the contents with an intensity that seemed out of place for a common drifter. The afternoon light fell across the page, illuminating the clear, strong signature of her father, Li Wei, and the official seal of the Nevada Territory, pressed into the paper years ago. "This is good," Jonah murmured, tracing the seal with his thumb. "The seal is correct for the period. The signature is clear. The property lines are properly recorded." He looked up at her. "Finch's document is a fiction. But a fiction with the mayor's backing is a dangerous thing." "I know," Mai said, her voice barely a whisper. "The sheriff is his man. The judge is his friend. The law in Stone Creek is whatever Alastair Finch says it is." Jonah nodded, refolding the deed with care. "He's done this before. Not here, but in other towns along the proposed railroad line. He acquires key properties through coercion or fraud, then sells them to the railway syndicate for an astronomical profit. He's not just a bully, he's a thief on a grand scale." Mai's blood ran cold. "How do you know this?" He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a weariness in his eyes, a history she couldn't begin to guess at. "Before I was just Jonah. I worked for the railroad. Not laying track. Investigating land claims. I tracked a syndicate from Utah to here, a group of men using forged documents and intimidation to clear a path for the new line. Finch's name was on my list." He handed the deed back to her. "I wasn't looking for him when I rode into this town. I was just passing through. Seems trouble has a way of finding a man." The revelation settled over her, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just about her saloon. It was about a vast, faceless enterprise of greed and power. She was a tiny obstacle in the path of something immense. The fight was not hers alone, but that made it feel even more hopeless. "So what happens now?" she asked, her hands clutching the deed as if it were an anchor. "He will come back. He will bring the sheriff." "Yes, he will," Jonah said plainly. He walked back into the main room of the saloon, his boots echoing on the floorboards. He stood by the window, looking out at the dusty street. "You have two choices. The first is the one he gave you. You pack a bag, you take the evening stage, and you start over somewhere else. He'll let you go. You're not the prize, the land is. You'll be alive, and you'll be free." He paused, letting the weight of that option settle. It was the sensible choice. The safe choice. It was also the choice that would dishonor everything her parents had built. "And the second choice?" she asked, her voice stronger now. He turned from the window to face her. "The second choice is you stay. You fight him. Not with guns. He has more men and a bought and paid for sheriff. You fight him with this." He tapped his temple. "You fight him with the law. His power is built on the belief that no one will challenge him. We challenge him. It will be dangerous, and we might not win. But you won't be alone. A choice. Run and live with the shame, or stay and risk everything for a home that was already half lost." She looked at the jade dragon on the bar, its green form solid and unyielding. It was a symbol of endurance, of beauty that survived the harshest conditions. It was her father's spirit, her mother's resilience. It was hers. "I will not run," Mai said. The words felt solid in her mouth, real and true. "This is my home. A slow, faint smile touched Jonah's lips. It was the first she had seen, and it changed his face, softening the hard lines. "I thought you might say that." The sound of heavy boots on the boardwalk outside cut the moment short. The swing doors burst open, and Sheriff Brody filled the entrance. He was a large, florid man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest. A tarnished star was pinned crookedly to it. He held a warrant in one hand. "Jonah," the sheriff said, his voice a gravelly boom. "You're under arrest for assault and interfering with official town business." He didn't look at Jonah, but at my. His eyes held a smug, triumphant light. He held up a second document. "And Miss Lynn, this is an official eviction notice, signed by Mayor Finch in his capacity as magistrate, citing the settlement of a legal debt. You have until sunrise tomorrow to vacate the premises. After that, anything left inside becomes the property of the new owner." The law, twisted and corrupt, was now officially against them. Finch hadn't waited for sundown. He had moved to crush them immediately. The paper in the sheriff's hand was a death sentence for her life in Stone Creek. Jonah didn't move. He simply watched the sheriff, his calm a stark contrast to Brody's blustering authority. "That warrant for my arrest," Jonah said, his voice even. "Does it have a judge's signature, or just the mayor's?" Sheriff Brody flushed. "The mayor is the highest authority in this town. His signature is the law." "Not according to territorial statute," Jonah replied. "A warrant for a felony assault requires a circuit judge's review. You try to take me on that flimsy piece of paper, and you'll be the one answering to a U.S. Marshal for illegal detention." The sheriff faltered. He was a bully, not a lawyer. He knew how to enforce Finch's will, but he was lost when confronted with the actual law. He glared at Jonah, his confidence wavering. He was out of his depth. "You've got until morning," Brody snarled, shifting his focus back to the eviction notice, the one part of his task he felt sure of. "Be gone by sunrise." He slapped the notice onto the bar and backed out of the saloon, his retreat far less imposing than his entrance. The notice lay on the bar, a white scar on the dark wood. Sunrise. They had less than 12 hours. "He bought her some time," Mai said, looking at Jonah with a new understanding. "He fought with knowledge, not just force." "Not much," Jonah admitted. He walked over to the notice and read it carefully. "But maybe enough." He looked at her. "The telegraph office is still open. Finch will have a man watching it, but he'll be watching for a message going out. Not one coming in." He explained his plan. It was audacious, a long shot that depended on a single telegraph wire stretching across hundreds of miles of empty desert and on a man whose name he hadn't spoken in years. He would need to send a coded message to the U.S. Marshal's office in Carson City. It was a gamble. The message might not get through in time. The marshal might not come. "Finch's man will see you," Mai said. "He'll see me go in," Jonah corrected. "But the telegraph operator is a federal employee. He can't legally be stopped from sending a message. All we can do is light the fuse and hope the powder is dry." As night fell, a heavy, watchful silence descended on Stone Creek. Finch's men were visible on the street, making their presence known. They were there to ensure Mai and Jonah didn't slip away in the dark, and to make sure the town knew who was in charge. Inside the saloon, Mai lit a single lamp, the glow pushing back the shadows. She and Jonah worked in quiet tandem. He wrote out his message, a cryptic series of phrases that would mean nothing to anyone but the intended recipient. Mai packed a small crate with her parents' most precious belongings, a few porcelain bowls, her mother's silk shawl, the ledgers, and the jade dragon. She wrapped it carefully in the shawl and placed it inside. Whether she stayed or fled, she would not leave it behind. When the time was right, Jonah slipped out the back. Mai watched from the window as he moved through the alleyways, a shadow among shadows. An hour passed, then another. Each minute stretched into an eternity. She sat at a table, the eviction notice in front of her, the silence of the saloon pressing in. She thought of her parents, of the laughter that used to fill this room. Finch wasn't just stealing a building, he was stealing her past. Just after midnight, Jonah returned as silently as he had left. He gave a single, curt nod. "It's sent." "And now?" she asked. "Now we wait for the sun," he said. "And we see if the law is worth more than the paper it's written on." They did not sleep. They sat in the dim light of the saloon, the air thick with unspoken tension. They were two strangers, a saloon keeper and a former railroad agent, bound together against a common enemy. As the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, the sound of boots on the boardwalk began to grow. A crowd was gathering. I stood and walked to the front window. Mayor Finch was there, flanked by Sheriff Brody and a dozen hired men. Behind them, half the town had turned out to watch, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and shame. This was the final act of her public humiliation. "It's time," Jonah said from behind her. He stood by the bar, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol, not as a threat, but as a simple fact. Mai took a deep breath. She walked to the doors and pushed them open, stepping out onto the porch to face the crowd. She would not hide. She would not cower. She would meet this end on her feet. Finch smiled, a victor's smile. "Good morning, Miss Lynn. I see you've decided to be sensible. Your time is up." He gestured for Brody and his men to move forward. But as they took their first step, another sound cut through the morning air. It was faint at first, then clearer, the steady, rhythmic beat of horses' hooves, moving at a purposeful pace. Heads turned. Down the main street, 3 riders were approaching. The man in the lead was tall and broad-shouldered, with a graying mustache and a federal star gleaming on his chest. The U.S. Marshal had come. The crowd parted for the riders. The Marshal reined in his horse directly in front of Finch, his gaze cold and hard. "Alistair Finch." Finch's smile faltered, confusion and alarm warring on his face. "I am. What is the meaning of this?" The Marshal dismounted, pulling a warrant from his coat. "You're under arrest. By the authority of the United States federal government, on charges of conspiracy, mail fraud, and obstruction of federal commerce related to the Central Pacific Railroad." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Finch's face went pale, the color draining away until he looked like a man made of wax. His power, built on town-level intimidation, was nothing against the reach of federal law. "This is absurd," Finch stammered. "A misunderstanding. You can explain it to the federal judge in Carson City," the Marshal said flatly. He nodded to his deputies, who moved in and secured Finch's hands behind his back. Sheriff Brody stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. The Marshal looked at him, then at the crooked star on his chest. "I think you're done with this," he said, and simply plucked the badge from Brody's vest. It was over. Just like that. The foundation of Finch's power had crumbled to dust. The townspeople who had been silent for so long began to murmur, their fear turning to anger now that its source was shackled. Mai stood on the porch, watching it all unfold. She hadn't thrown a punch or fired a shot. Her victory had come from a single, quiet choice, the choice to stand her ground. Jonah came to stand beside her. He looked not at the scene in the street, but at her. 6 months later, the first snows of winter were dusting the peaks of the mountains surrounding Stone Creek. The Jade Dragon was no longer quiet and struggling. It was warm, bright, and filled with the noise of a town reborn. The railroad had arrived, but on honest terms, bringing prospectors, merchants, and families. The town was booming. Mai had hired a cook and a young woman to help her serve tables. She had expanded the menu and even added 2 rooms for boarders upstairs. She was no longer just a survivor, she was a businesswoman, respected and secure. Jonah was still there. He had never left. The railroad had offered him his old job back, but he had declined. He handled the saloon's books and supplies, his sharp mind for details proving as valuable as his steady hand had been that day. The gun he wore was mostly for show now, a relic of a past life. One evening, as the saloon buzzed with warmth and conversation, Mai was polishing the Jade Dragon, which now sat in a place of honor on the new back bar. Its green surface glowed in the lamplight. Jonah came up beside her. He didn't speak, but placed his hand over hers where it rested on the cool stone of the statue. They stood there for a moment, looking at their reflection in the polished barwood, then out at the room they had built together. A home, Mai had learned, wasn't just a place you inherited or a deed you held. It was the piece of ground you refused to surrender, and the people you chose to stand with when the sun went down. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.